I've turned on recording.
Thank you. Do you mind just making it full screen? Thank you. Perfect. All right, great. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. And in the meantime, Lisa has thoughtfully put a prompt in the chat that we'd love everyone to be thinking about why write a science paper, as that will be the topic of our first discussion. So we'll give people a couple more minutes to join and be thinking about that in the meantime. Looks like we've got quite a few people joining, so that's great. So we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. A minute does seem long when you're just sitting in silence, doesn't it? But we are really excited to be here today. My name is Kathryn Corcoran. I'm a journal publishing manager at Wiley, and I work with AGU on their journals. And I'm really happy today to be presenting with my colleagues on publishing with AGU tips and tricks. And I know Katie wanted to speak a little bit about the presentation today. So we can go to the next slide. And Katie, if you want to say a few words.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathryn. And I wanted to just welcome everyone from across NOAA to this presentation. The NOAA Central Library is very proud to bring this to you. The library is very much part of and wants to be a part of the research process. And that includes helping our NOAA scientists find the literature that they need to create their research or complete their research, all the way through to them writing and publishing their own research. So the library is very, very happy to bring you Wiley and AGU journals today. If you do have questions about the publishing process or about the research life cycle and how the library fits into that, I'd love for you to reach out to library.reference@noaa.gov. And as Kathryn said, this presentation is recorded, and everyone who registered will be given a copy of that recording. Thank you.
To really stop muting myself. All right, thanks, Katie. Well, so next slide, we'll just go over the agenda briefly. Today we'll be discussing how to write a science paper presented by Lisa Beal, editor-in-chief of JGR Oceans, followed by navigating the peer review process by Chris Karnauskas, editor at Geophysical Research Letters. And finally, myself will be presenting on publishing open access, and then we'll have time for a Q&A that we'll hopefully have a really good discussion for. So next slide. Just so you know who's speaking, again, these are our presenters for today. And with that, we can dive right in, and I will hand it over to Lisa to discuss how to write a science paper.
Hey, thanks, Kathryn. Hi, everybody. Good to see such a big turnout. Thank you for coming. If we can go on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we write a science paper. And to think about this, it's good to think first about why we write a science paper. Next slide. So why write a science paper? Helping this can help us understand how to write a science paper. And you're welcome to put your ideas in the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll hear from you. Why write a science paper? Making you guys work way too soon, huh? Okay, I see a couple of answers here. Great ones. To advance knowledge across the field. Sharing and communicating knowledge. To communicate your new findings to peers. It's a great one. Okay, so I hear there's a lot of communication here. And we're thinking about knowledge, and we're thinking about specifically, right, new knowledge to convey our research results and information. Excellent. Okay, so we want to communicate, and the reason we want to communicate is we have something new to say, right? So these are the reasons why we write a science paper. So ultimately, we're writing a science paper because we have something new we want to communicate with our colleagues. So next slide. So with that in mind, then, let's talk about what you might put in your science paper that could help you communicate the new ideas and knowledge that you have from your science. And the abstract is probably the most important part of your paper. And it really has these three main roles. I really like these visual abstracts, which this is an example of too. So you might think about putting together a visual abstract. But the abstract has these three main roles. So when you're writing, start with the abstract, because it kind of seems a hard place to start. You know, often we'll start with the methods or something like that, or even an introduction, you know, kind of like a background to the topic. But if you don't have an abstract first, you don't really know where you're going with your paper. You don't know, if you don't know what's new, then you can't communicate it clearly. So really the abstract is a place to improve your research question and to really figure out, what do I have that's new here? And then a really important role for the abstract, once you submit your paper, is it convinces people like me, the editors at your journal, that this is a paper that is in scope for the journal, and that there's something new that you're communicating in this paper. About half of the manuscripts at JGR Oceans, we're a little more than a third of our manuscripts are rejected without review. And so it's important that your abstract, in your abstract, really shines through why you've written this paper, which is because you have something new to say and you want to communicate that clearly. After publication, of course, the abstract is super important, because that's where everybody's going to go to look at what your paper's about, and that's how you're going to attract readers to the rest of your paper. So let's move on to the introduction. And the introduction, this is a place where, again, we can think back to why we're writing this paper. We're writing this paper because we have something new to say. And that means that, most importantly in the introduction, I would argue, is that you need to create a knowledge gap, because background material is important, context is super important. But if we don't establish that there is a knowledge gap that we are filling, then we haven't established that we have something new to say. So really, this is the role of the introduction, even more, I would argue, than introducing a lot of background information, which sometimes, depending on who your audience is, may not even be needed, right? Or it may be that they can go to a textbook to find that, or it may be that you can cite other papers. And so the choice of how much background information, is very much dependent on your audience. But this creation of the knowledge gap is universal in the role of the introduction. You must create a knowledge gap and get the reader curious about what is missing or what is not clear or what is unknown to date that you are going to reveal in your paper. So let's move on to the methods. I think this is probably the most straightforward part of a paper, right? Probably most of you are like, well, this is where I describe what I did. So, but the question is, how do you describe that? So in terms of sort of a glossary of terms, in terms of how your peers are going to understand your research, it's really important to have the language down. And so the best way to have the language of your discipline, of your topic down, is to read, of course, other papers on the topic. And so you really need to become, you know, an expert in order to establish the knowledge gap, and in order to be able to communicate directly your methodologies and your science. So here, you know, here's a slide that I got from the medical sciences, actually, as you can see from the MD, but you know, the principle's the same. Basically, read science papers, and you know, particularly read science papers of your advisor if you're a grad student, but you guys are researchers, so you know, read the papers appropriate around the topic upon which you're working. So let's move to the results. I actually made this slide myself because these original slide deck did not include what you should do with your results. And I guess, you know, I guess it's pretty straightforward, but I think that it's good to take a little bit of time about how we can structure our results to communicate the most effectively with our readers. So initially, I would say know your key findings. And of course, you should know this already if you iterated on your abstract. But even more importantly is develop a hierarchy of your findings, because this can really help you structure the paper clearly with a thread, and also help orient the reader around what you think is most important. And so this kind of hierarchy ideas is I think is really crucial also in terms of knowing what we put in and what we leave out of the paper, right? That can be very difficult in terms of, you know, when do I have enough? When have I said enough? If you create a hierarchy of ideas, then you can make sure that you have the most important things said, you know, and the least important things, and maybe some of those least important things, you know, kind of fall off your scope in the end, and they're the things you needn't, you know, that you needn't say. So creating a hierarchy of ideas is quite important. Show your findings. That's pretty obvious. You're going to present your figures, your tables, your results that support your findings. And you're going to explain to the reader how these findings fill the knowledge gap that you established in the introduction. And I think this third panel is pretty important too. What to leave out, what not to say. It is important, as important arguably as what you leave in, because you don't want to distract or confuse the reader with irrelevant information. So for example, one example of this might be that, you know, in thinking about the time and effort you put into the paper, it may be that you spent a lot of time and effort going down a dead end, right? That didn't really give you much in the end towards your new findings. And so that's where to think about how much of that information and that methodology you include in the paper, how much is actually relevant at the end of the day to what you want to say. So finally, a discussion, or you could call this conclusions, or you could even have separate discussion and conclusions. It really depends on what you have to say and how much of it is definitive. In this part of the paper, the last part of the paper, you want to summarize, of course, your main findings. You want to put those in the context of major other studies. You might even, you want to recognize the limitations of what you're saying. So that would be a place to discuss uncertainties, places you think maybe you might have done things differently, or you could do things differently in the future. And future work, you could talk about future work, but you could also talk about implications moving forward. So what, in terms of your findings, what does that imply for the field? What should the reader take away from that in terms of maybe applying ideas to their own research? Implications are really important. In JGR Oceans, we like to see that you have something new, you have a new finding, and that you have thought about what the implications, what the significance of those new findings are, and explain them to the reader. So I think that's my final slide. Can we go on to the next one? Yes. Okay, awesome. All right. So I think we're going to have time for questions at the end. So I will leave it there and pass the chair to Chris.
Thank you, Lisa. As Katie mentioned earlier, I'm Chris Karnauskas, and I'm an associate professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences at CU Boulder. I also happen to be a fellow of CERES, so I actually have a pretty close connection to NOAA myself. So yeah, I'm currently an editor for GRL. I was a JGR Oceans editor before that, and with something like 15 years on AGU editorial boards at this point, I still cannot claim to know all of the tips and tricks, as this webinar is called, but I'll just try to share a few insights that I've gathered over the years, both as an editor and an author. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I made this, you can tell a non-professional person made a slide like this. It's just worthwhile for authors to sort of understand the publishing workflow, I think. Basically the journey that your manuscript takes once you click submit. And just knowing exactly where your manuscript is on this map sort of helps you manage your tasks and communications with the journal and expectations and preparing for next steps and stuff. So I'll just kind of run through this quickly. The first stop is of course the journal staff. It doesn't go directly to the editors. So this is where the manuscript will be checked for adherence to various policies that the journal has, particularly data availability statements. And this is where you also might see staff get back to you asking for you to shorten it because you're if it's GRL, you might be like a fraction of a publication unit over the limit. So you've got to do something about that to go on. Once it's past those initial checks, your manuscript's going to be typically forwarded to the editor-in-chief of the journal, who's then going to give it a quick look for scope and then assign it to an editor who's going to handle it from there on. Occasionally editors will, if you see associate editor, it's because the editor really needs some special expertise help from someone or a connection to a particular community of potential reviewers that's needed for that paper. But either way, the editor and AE are going to curate a list of potential reviewers and then start going down the list until we get 2 or 3, or however many the editor seeks for that paper. And as Lisa pointed out, they don't always go out to peer review. The editor may decide not to send the paper out for peer review for any number of reasons, most of the time because it doesn't meet the journal's scope, or in the case of GRL, this mandate to publish high impact, innovative and timely articles that represent major advances with a broad and immediate need for rapid publication. And that's that sounds like a really high bar. So please don't take it personally or as a reflection of the basic quality of your research in the event your manuscript may not be sent out for review. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute on handling rejection. But we can go on to the next step, or next slide, please. So once those reviews come back, the editor will make an initial decision, and that's there's some nuance, but it basically amounts to either rejecting the paper based on those reviews at that point, versus proceeding with revisions with the general expectation that if we proceed to revisions, this paper will probably get published after some number of revisions. It's never a guarantee, but it is unusual to reject a paper after the authors have revised it a number of times. We editors certainly try to avoid situations like that. So then it'll go back to the author with that decision, and in that case, if the decision's minor or major revisions, you conduct those revisions and then enter the loop again, and it'll be checked all over again by staff, perhaps even more thoroughly this time, including figure formats and things like that, because there's actually a chance that it could be accepted straight away at that point without further revision. But it could go back out to review any number of times until the editor and peer reviewers are satisfied. And then the next slide, please. And so once it's accepted, it goes to the publisher for a moment, and in this case, it's Wiley. And the next thing you're going to see is the page proofs, and that's where they've caught all your missing references and undefined acronyms. And that's really the last time you're going to have any influence over the contents of your paper before it goes out to the world as a published journal article. So it's a good idea to read those page proofs carefully and make any small tweaks that you see fit. And so I know as an author, myself including, it can sometimes feel very much like your paper has sort of been lost or forgotten, but it's actually, you can see it's a pretty orderly process. There's never any harm in sending the journal a message asking for a status update. I wouldn't do it every day, but it's honestly not going to make the peer reviewers who are volunteering their time to speed up. But most reviewers are going to push their review to the deadline, or even worse. But and I should also mention the editors are basically volunteers as well. And while most of us do stay on top of our cues from day to day, I am never personally offended if an author does reach out and politely encourage me to double check that if they suspect something has been hung up somewhere for too long. So next slide, please. So as you're sort of closing in on submission, you obviously have a few things to think about. And if you've already written a complete draft, you probably already know, you've decided what journal you're targeting. But if you don't know, there's many things you can do. You can consult your co-authors, especially if some of them are mid-career or senior, and can give good advice on that. Read the journal scope, as Lisa alluded to. Definitely a good idea to read that no matter what. And you can also write directly to an editor listed on the journal's website. We field those questions all the time, and we're pretty well calibrated with our own journal at this point, where if you just share your abstract, we can probably give you a pretty good sense of whether it fits in the scope of that journal or not. Something that, pretty much bites me every time I'm submitting a paper, one of the most effective ways that I can think to ensure your manuscript proceeds efficiently through review is how you craft your list of suggested reviewers. And of course, how does it go on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend, and you want this finally off your plate, you want your paper submitted, and you sense you're like 2 or 3 screens on GEMS from being done, and then it says, please list a minimum of 3 suggested reviewers, and your co-authors aren't there, or they're in different time zones, and there you are. So bring that up with your co-authors as early as possible. Like I would suggest, when you send around to your co-authors a first draft of your manuscript, I would pull out a little post-it note and start, asking for, ideas for people who would be good reviewers for the paper, so that you're ready and you can actually get that off your plate before the weekend. So our system, GEMS, by the way, it automatically cross-checks all of your suggestions, and it will flag any conflict of interest of various types. Not all types, so depending on how diligent the editor is, there's really nothing stopping us from just doing a Command F on your CV or Google Scholar, but you don't want to give the editor reason to be suspicious that you're listing your best friends and collaborators. So don't do that. But the more the better. That's my number one piece of advice here, is when you're suggesting reviewers, suggest as many as you can think of that are appropriate and suitable reviewers. I'd say before or beginning with the pandemic, but definitely before, it has been really challenging to actually secure 2 or 3 reviewers in a timely manner for each manuscript we handle. Just the volume can become overwhelming, and everyone is so busy. So the more you suggest, the faster your manuscript status will change to under review, and that's always satisfying. Um, every editor probably works a bit differently. I try to end up with a mix of reviewers suggested by the authors and some ideas of my own, but honestly, sometimes it ends up being 100% from the author's list, if that's what it comes down to, and that's who we end up getting to agree to review the manuscript. So suggest as many as you can, not just 3, even 5, 6, 7 is fine. And then the other things, the key points in plain language summary, those are things that people tend to forget until the day they're submitting their paper, and you don't want to rush that. It helps your chances for the editor and reviewers to really understand and be excited about your research, if that's well written. Next slide, please. So, okay, after you've submitted your paper, do yourself a favor and close all of the folders and browser tabs related to that paper and forget about it. That said, we're human, and in the event that you or one of your co-authors goes ahead and rereads it after submission, you're going to find typos, missing references, incorrect figure label or something like that. Make a list, and plan to deal with those little things when you're on your first formal revision cycle. Unless it's really significant, like dropped in the completely wrong figure into your manuscript and it's gonna, actually affect the outcome of the review, I would just let it go. You don't need to set yourself back a week by writing the journal, pulling it back. Perhaps even worse, getting the editor to communicate something to the reviewers on something that isn't that big a deal might just give the impression that you were, submitting it in a hasty manner, and that's probably not good. Don't hesitate to ask for updates if you think it's been a while. But in most cases, it's just reviewers taking the full period of time, or it took us a while to secure reviewers, but we don't hold it against you if you just want a little peace of mind and reach out. And then in the event that your manuscript's rejected, which has happened to me a million times, it's hard, but I try not to take it personally, take it as an opportunity. Presumably the rejection comes with constructive reviews. You can use those to your advantage when you submit it again. I also strongly recommend not replying to the rejection email for about 24 hours if you're going to reply. Science is science, but we love our work and we care deeply about it, and oftentimes, if not always, feel very invested in our papers. So, forward it to your co-authors and vent. I love doing that. Get it all out. And then think about whether you really want to unload that on the editor. And, that said, while it's extremely rare, successful appeals have happened. Just be honest with yourself. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the editor reading those reviews. And if you decide to, write and ask for an appeal of the decision, go for it, but in a, respectful manner that kind of points out where there were substantive errors in the review. And I would say, like, in 15 years of editing for various AGU journals, I've changed my mind a few times. So it's when we're wrong, we are hopefully mature enough to recognize that and go ahead and make things right, or give authors a suitable chance to give a rebuttal if we weren't going to. Okay, next slide, please. So let's see, during or after revising, I'm almost done here. I mean, this is actually a short message. Basically, you're going to want to scale your responses to the reviewers according to how many times you've been through the cycle together. On the first round, it's not uncommon for your response letter to be a few pages long, several pages long, including figures and stuff, especially if the reviewers had a large number of major comments. But and at that point, it's going back to the reviewers. So you really want to engage them thoroughly and show them that you're taking their comments seriously. But I've had grad students and postdocs, early in their career prepare like a 10-page long response letter when we're very clearly on like the final round with minor comments. you don't want to do that. When an editor opens the rebuttal letter and it's like that long, it's going back to the reviewers. So, sometimes it is okay just to say, thank you, we have made that change, when you're really dealing with minor things. But also, remember the role of peer reviewers. Don't let them necessarily take over your paper. Some reviewers really get into the paper and they may be well-meaning, but sometimes you feel like they're sort of hijacking your paper a little bit. And if you get that sense, editors know the role of peer reviewers as well. It's okay to disagree with a comment and explain in your rebuttal letter in a respectful way why, and move on. We all, of course, have to make compromises sometimes when dealing with multiple peer reviewers, which may be saying different things, even at odds with one another, but you don't have to compromise on everything. It's your paper. And so when you're submitting, especially long rebuttal letters, it's great to summarize with a few bullet points at the top of it for the editor. Like, these are the 3 main changes that we've made. And then the last slide, please. So, if you haven't served as a peer reviewer before, just kind of like funding proposals, it's usually a good idea. You do benefit, just anecdotally from early career people and students and postdocs of mine. They usually say that they've benefited from serving as a peer reviewer. You can sort of imagine how it helps you get inside the head of reviewers and see the process from the other side. And it's it's one thing I try to do for relatively new reviewers is to actually provide them with the other reviewers. So they've submitted their review and then we make a decision on our editorial end. It's okay for us to share the other reviewers with you if you're an early career and you want to see how did your review compare to the other ones. Are there things that maybe you missed or some unique things that you caught? I think that's totally fine, and you can always write to the editor and ask, would you mind sharing the other reviews when the decision has been made? So that's all the little tip and trick type of things that I wanted to share, and I think it's time for me to hand it over to Kathryn for open access.
Thanks, Chris. All right, everyone. Again, I'm Kathryn Corcoran, and I'm a journal publishing manager at Wiley. And I'll be taking you through today some things about open access that might help you decide if you'd like to publish your paper open access. So next slide, please. So this is a lot of information on one slide, and this presentation will be shared afterwards, so you don't have to read everything on here. But the big takeaway here is that open access is really just one part of a larger initiative, which is open science. And open science is the movement to make scientific research and its dissemination accessible to all levels of society, amateur or professional. So initiatives like open recognition and reward, open data and software, these are all designed to help make research more accessible to researchers and to the public. The open access component of this has been going on for over 20 years, but it had started becoming more and more mainstream around 2009 when governments and funders started focusing on the benefits of open access by launching their own policies. And we'll talk about what those policies are. They're either gold or green in just a few minutes. But what we're seeing is that the global movements around open access have really been picking up for the last couple of years. You may have, for example, heard about Plan S. Researchers who have to publish their work in order to progress their careers, in order to advance their research area, must navigate this new landscape to ensure that they're compliant with relevant mandates. In addition, a lot of authors are choosing to publish open access because they believe in kind of the cause behind it, which we can talk about in just a second. So next slide, please. Thank you. So in addition to complying with funder policies and mandates, authors are choosing to publish open access in part because they believe in making science more open, accessible, efficient, democratic, and transparent. But they're also seeing much more tangible benefits. We're seeing that open access articles are downloaded as much as 3 times as much as subscription articles. They can receive an average of 2 times as many citations as subscription articles. And open access articles receive 4.5 times as much altmetric attention as subscription articles. For those of you who don't know what altmetric is, it's a metric that tracks attention sources like academic citations, patents, posts on social media and web forums, Wikipedia articles, and Mendeley users. And they calculate a score that's intended to reflect the reach or popularity of the research output. So in sum, if you're looking to make your research more accessible and you want to potentially reach a wider audience, I would definitely recommend considering publishing open access. So next slide, please. This is becoming particularly relevant to AGU because its authors are taking up open access more and more. We've seen a strong shift of preference towards open access since about 2015, when we had 14% of content published by AGU was open access compared to 41% in 2021. And we're projecting up to 50% of articles will be open access by the end of 2022. I also just wanted to really quickly call out that the Geophysical Research Letters is moving to open access in 2023, and that may impact your plans to submit. So I would definitely recommend checking out the link there. We'll share this information after the presentation. But if you are considering publishing in Geophysical Research Letters, you should just be aware that it's transitioning to open access as of January 1st, 2023. So let's talk a little bit more about what open access is and how to choose the right option for your research. So next slide, please. Thank you. So there are 4 types of open access, and the most common are green OA and gold OA. Green OA are articles that are made freely available after an embargo period. It's typically 12 to 24 months. Authors retain the right to use their articles for certain purposes, but do not own copyright, and that's a key difference. In gold open access articles, they are immediately freely available to read, download, reuse, and share. But the author pays or the funder pays an article publication charge. And that is to cover the cost of publishing, as we discussed in the chat. It's also published under a Creative Commons license. So that means that the author retains copyright. And we can discuss the rights that go with copyright in the next slide. But that's the key difference, is that the author owns the copyright when we're talking about open access papers. The other 2 types are much less common. Bronze OA just means that an article has been made freely available to read temporarily, and it's typically around some kind of promotional event. So an article will be picked up by the news, the publisher will make the article freely available to read for a couple of weeks and then put it back behind the paywall. Diamond or platinum open access means that the article is published as open access and the author retains copyright, but there's no fee to publish. So for example, the journal Perspectives of Earth and Space Scientists that AGU launched a couple years ago is a diamond open access journal. So all of the articles are published open access, but authors do not pay a fee. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit more information about how open access works within journals, because it can be a little bit confusing. Journals typically fall into one of 3 categories. So either it is a fully gold open access journal, meaning that all articles published in the journal are open access and authors are required to publish open access. And in the cases of non-diamond open access journals, they are required to pay an APC that could be covered by their funder, and we'll talk about that a little bit. It could also be a hybrid journal, meaning that the default is to publish articles behind the paywall as subscription articles, and no APC is levied. But authors could choose to publish open access by opting into open access during the production process. And at Wiley, that's in author services, but it may be different for other publishers. Or it's a subscription journal, which means that there's no open access option offered. And that's pretty rare, and we don't have any journals like that with AGU. So in other words, if you're publishing in a hybrid journal, such as the sections of Journal Geophysical Research, including JGR Oceans, then you have the option to publish open access or subscription. Whereas in a gold open access journal, like AGU Advances, you must publish open access and pay an APC. So regardless of the type of journal that you publish in, open access or hybrid, if you choose to publish open access, you'll have the choice of 3 license types, which I'll review now on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is also a lot of information. And what we found in a 2019 survey from Wiley, we heard from 2,600 researchers about their experiences with open access or open science. And an incredible 66% said that they were completely confused about what kind of license to use. So let's try to break this down a little bit. When you publish in a subscription journal, as I said, the copyright stays with the publisher. But when you publish open access, you publish under a Creative Commons license, and you as the author retain the copyright, and the public is allowed to reuse the content. The three types of Creative Commons licenses are differentiated by what you can do with the content after it's published. So on the left, the Creative Commons attribution, or CC BY, is the most accommodating of the licenses offered. It's recommended for the maximum dissemination and use of licensed materials. One step over from that is the CC BY ND license, and that restricts, or CC BY NC, I'm sorry, which restricts commercial use, and that's in the middle. And then the final piece on the right is CC BY ND, which restricts derivative works. So in practicality, how does this actually affect you? It means that you have to be really careful when you are receiving funding or receiving a grant that requires open access, that you read really carefully what license type that they require and make sure that the journal that you're submitting to offers that kind of license type. AGU typically recommends authors choose the CC BY license as it's more permissive and supports attribution. But again, it can be a case-by-case basis of what's most appropriate. Next slide, please. So if you've decided that you do want to publish open access, one of the first questions that always comes up for authors is, how do we pay for it? And there are various funding options to help authors cover their article processing charges, both at AGU and broadly. I'll be talking mostly about how you can do that with AGU, but some of this stuff is applicable more broadly, and I'll call that out. So you'll first want to check out the journal's publication fees page. And I've linked AGU's fees pages there in the first link under more information. And you'll want to do that just to understand first what charges are applicable. Because there can be APCs can be different for each journal, even within the same publisher. Then you can investigate to see what funding options are available through the journal or publisher that you've chosen. So let's focus on AGU and Wiley for now, though. So in many cases at Wiley, APCs are paid by an author's funder or institution, and there are typically two pathways to that. The first is a Wiley Open Access account, which is a fund or institution that which is a fund that institutions have set aside for eligible researchers to cover their APCs. And then the link to the Wiley Open Access accounts is the second link on this page that you can check out if your institution has a funder account, whether you move from NOAA, and you want to know in the future. The second pathway is a transformational or a transitional agreement. You may have also heard them go by read and publish agreements. These are agreements between publishers like Wiley and institutions and funders that provide access to subscription content and funding for open access publication to eligible researchers. There are a number of transformational agreements in place at Wiley, and I encourage you to read through that third link to see if you are eligible for funding under a transformational agreement. If your funder or institution does not have funding, you should next check whether you're eligible for a discount available to authors from low and middle income countries. And these vary from 50% to 100% coverage. And that's the last link on this page. Finally, if you are still facing barriers to publish open access, then you can contact AGU at the journal inbox or in your cover letter to request a waiver. AGU really strives to balance between open science, inclusion, and sustainability, and has created a number of mechanisms to ensure fees are not a barrier for those without access to funding to publish. And finally, if none of the above works, I just want to remind you that you can always publish in a hybrid journal for a subscription article if you don't have the funding for it. We do want to make sure that that option is always available to authors, and AGU does have a number of hybrid options that you can consider instead. So I just want to close with that AGU and Wiley are always here to guide you through this process. We know it can be really overwhelming and confusing, so please do reach out to us with any questions or concerns. There are a lot of really great advantages to publishing open access, so I do hope you'll consider it. But if you have any questions about it, please either we can discuss it now in the Q&A, or you can always reach out to us after the presentation. And with that, so that was a whistle-stop tour of open access. With that, let's move on to Q&A. I think I saw a couple questions come through in the chat. And if our other presenters could just turn their cameras back on, what we'll do is go through the Q&A to see what we can answer. So I did answer one question already, and that was, but I wanted to dig into it a little bit more, which is what do APCs go towards? So in the old publishing model, the cost of publishing was carried by libraries and institutions who would pay to subscribe to content. So that subscription revenue would pay for editors and for the GEM submission system and the production apparatus and all of that. With the shift to open access, those costs still exist, but the institutions and the funders are no longer paying for it through subscription. So we need to charge an article processing charge to ensure that we can continue with publishing. So that's what those charges go towards, and that's why open access papers are charged in APC, but subscription papers are not. It's essentially moving the cost from the end of the process to the beginning. So the next one, does the editor or publisher do anything to help institutions meet their green OA mandates if that's what their institution requires? And yes, so for green OA, you are able to post your article to your institution's repository so that it's compliant with a green OA mandate. And then we also, of course, offer a number of open access options that if you're publishing gold open access, you're also then fulfilling the requirements of a green OA mandate. So we do try to help authors navigate their policies and what their green OA mandate is and how they can comply with that. And then, of course, after that 12 to 24 month embargo, you can post that article in a repository anywhere. And that way it can also be compliant with green OA mandates. Joan with the question on OSTP. So OSTP, if everyone's not aware, is a new memo that came out of the White House that removes the 12-month embargo period for federally funded research. And we are still in discussions about that. And so I'd love to follow up with more information once we have it. But this was something that's been in conversation for a while, but that a lot of people in the publishing industry, ourselves included, were not made aware that it was coming now. So we are still in discussions and still trying to figure out what the implications are to that. But we'll hopefully have some more information for folks soon. Another one for me, okay. Could you provide examples of how Creative Commons licenses might limit downstream uses? E.g., what would be considered a derivative work? You know, that's a great question. And what I think I'll do is follow up with some more information that you guys can read on your own. But essentially, and actually, if you could just go back a couple slides. Yes, Chris, you're right. The OSC mandate is not going into effect, I think it's like December 31st, 2025. To answer the question about the derivative works, so this is that, so this is if you are redistributing either commercially or non-commercially in any format, as long as proper attribution is given and a link to the license is provided and the document indicate if changes were made. So let me get more information about this because I don't want to give you any false information, and I don't have a lot of experience with CC BY ND, unfortunately. Everybody pretty much chooses CC BY. So let me get you some more information on that after the meeting. I apologize that I can't go into more detail. Okay, do we have any questions other than those from the chat? I know that we have covered a lot of information here. Oh, one more, I think it was how to become a peer reviewer. And I think, Lisa, you mentioned in the chat a couple ways to do that. Chris, do you have any additions to that of how somebody might become a peer reviewer?
No, I think that's exactly right. You know, once you have published with an AGU journal, your name is in GEMS and it's searchable when editors go searching in by keywords and things like that. But yeah, it's once in a while on Twitter, I'll put out a solicitation for early career scientists, and I usually get like a flood of emails with pretty much what Lisa suggested, giving like a blurb about your research and your career stage and stuff like that, and then I don't know if we put it in GEMS or share it among the editors, but we try to utilize everybody who wants to review if they've got a qualification. Yeah.
Yeah, I do see a lot of advertisements too that go out for editors and peer reviewers. So if you're looking for to get involved either as an editor or a peer reviewer, you can also just keep an eye out on the social media sites of journals that you're interested in working with. How do I choose which journal to publish my work in? That's a great question. If Lisa or Chris, you want to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in on that, and I actually wanted to kind of reiterate as well what I wrote in the chat about there is an option now in JGR Oceans and other AGU journals when you want to become a reviewer to collaborate with a more senior colleague. You know, if you wanted to do that as a first-time reviewer, that's a great way to kind of get your feet wet. And so, you know, another way to become a reviewer would be to let your senior colleagues know that you're ready and you want to learn. And, you know, if they get asked to review, could you collaborate with them, you know, on that review and learn with them? So that's another great way of doing it. So back to the how do I choose which journal to publish my work in? So all the journal do have landing pages, and they'll have on that landing page, they'll describe the scope of the journal. And so that's certainly one way to, you know, a good way to start. Another way would be to look at this, you know, the citations that you have in your own work. You know, what do you consider to be most close to your own work in terms of contextually, and where was that published? You know, where are most of the articles, you know, that you've read on a similar topic published? That's another great way to figure out where to publish your manuscript.
I'll also just plug for Wiley anyway, and I'm sure other publishers have this too, but forget about them. But we have a journal finder tool on Wiley Author Services that I'll make sure to include in the follow-up material, but that will allow you to explore a bunch of different journals. If you're not sure that you have, you know, enough knowledge about what journals are publishing in the space and you're just looking for somewhere to start, the journal finder tool is a great place to start. See if any other questions are going to come through. I do see, yeah, there is one, Julio, it's not, it varies by journal as well. So if you're not sure of the journal's criteria, just reach out directly to the editors. I'm sure they'll always be happy to hear from folks who are interested in getting involved, particularly peer reviewers, because we, you know, as Chris and Lisa have both mentioned, you know, there is a lot of strain on the peer reviewers with just the volume that we're seeing. So definitely feel free to reach out to the editors and just ask and see. They'll also, I'm sure, be helpful in many cases with helping you understand what you might need to do to become a reviewer if you're not yet published, for example, or if their expertise, you know, your expertise is already covered in the journal, they may have a referral to another journal. So definitely always reach out.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I can see that somebody's asked, you know, whether they need to be a primary author to be a reviewer, you know, or, you know, it's okay to be a co-author. And as Chris said, it's not codified, right? So there's not a hard and fast rule. You know, I think I would say, though, that there's nothing that beats the experience of writing an article, you know, being the primary author, the one that's actually putting the sentences together before, you know, stepping into the pool of being a reviewer. You know, the two reflect on, you know, on one another. And I think it's hard to step into the shoes of a reviewer if you haven't first had that experience of putting together an article yourself. So it isn't, you know, hard and fast, but I would say that probably as an editor, at least for me, I would think it's pretty important that for somebody on their first go around as a reviewer has had at least one experience writing an article.
Thank you. Katie asks, concerning APCs, what about hybrid journals where NOAA subscribes? And that's a great question. So in hybrid journals, there are two pathways, as I mentioned previously. So one would be if you're going to publish a subscription journal. And in some cases, there are page fees applied, and in some cases there aren't. So again, it's always helpful to start at that publication fees page for the journal that you're considering applying to, so that you can understand exactly what fees are relevant to you to publish either subscription or open access. If you're publishing open access in a hybrid journal, we do still levy an APC. And that's because we remove that cost of that article from the subscription. It's kind of complicated, but basically it would be double dipping if we charge both. So we have to charge separately an open access fee, even in a hybrid journal, because we don't charge the libraries access open access content at any rate. So there, an APC is still levied, and your article would then be made available freely to download or read on publication. You know, one question that I haven't seen pop up, but that is, I think, on the top of everyone's mind is, what are we doing to make sure that, excuse me, that we make sure that we're balancing the diversity of the community with who's represented on our editorial boards and who is publishing in our journals. So, you know, Lisa, for example, I know JGR Oceans has been doing a lot around this, and I wanted to know if you'd like to share a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kathryn. Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about that. At JGR Oceans, we've been diversifying and expanding our board of editors. I think that's the main place that we've really been tackling these issues of equity and inclusion. And so it's been an exciting 18 months for us because we now have 5 new female editors, and we have 4 new editors from Asia, you know, among the other statistics. I think another important thing that we've been doing at JGR Oceans is really improving the communication among editors. And I think that's important too when it comes to the kinds of editorial decisions that we make, you know, in terms of whether we pass on that paper for review or in terms of whether we think the paper should be you know, reject and resubmit or major revisions or whatever the decision might be. That those decisions, of course, have a big impact on the authors, and so we've been increasing the amount of collaboration we do on decision making with papers. Of course, some are very straightforward, and you don't need to consult with another editor. But in some cases, that, you know, there's not such a straightforward decision to be made, and consultation is good. And I think particularly when the question is this paper in scope? You know, is it ready for review at JGR Oceans, or do we need to ask the authors to make it clear, for example, what's new, you know, in their abstract, or is the paper more of a technical manuscript that we should advise the author to maybe submit to a more technical journal? So those kind of questions, those kind of reject without review questions in particular, we're doing a lot more consultation than we used to, and that means that that those decisions never were taken lightly, but I can assure you that those decisions are not taken lightly. So that's another area where we've tried to tackle some potential bias, and going along with those decisions in terms of how we make them. So we can consult on them, we can you know, get one another's opinions on them, particularly, for example, editors that might be, you know, from a different country or something like that. That's one way. And another way is that we've developed a very simple rubric by which we look at the front matter, particularly the abstract, but also the PLS, the plain language summary, and the key points. When we're looking for that, what are we looking for to know, for example, that it's in scope for JGR Oceans? And the answer to that is really very simple. Does this paper communicate something new about the ocean? And it sounds so simple that you'd be surprised that there are any papers that don't pass that test, but there are. And with a simple rubric like that, the beauty in terms of equity and diversity is that we're not focusing on the authors of the manuscript. We're asking the same thing of every manuscript. We're not focusing on the institutions of the authors or the country where the authors are from, right? Because that's where subconscious bias can come into our decision making, because we're all human. So if you use a rubric like that, it's deceptively simple, but we're quite excited that we've managing to reduce further bias in our decision making by using that. So there's a few examples of how we're trying to tackle that, and we're really looking forward to accepting more and more manuscripts from our diversity of oceanographers all over the world.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we're at time. If you wouldn't mind, Natalie, just going to the last slide really quickly of the decks, I want to just call out that if anybody has any questions, one more slide, please. If anyone has any questions, you can contact myself or, as Katie mentioned in the beginning, library.reference@noaa.gov. I know we talked about a couple things that we'll be following up with, and that includes a link to this recording, as well as the slides. And I'll also follow up with a little bit more information about non-derivative work and how that last license works. And Joan will also follow up because I'm sure I've gone off topic there. So why don't we close with that? And thank you so much to Lisa and Chris for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Yeah, no problem. And I see somebody's asking about feedback, so I'd be delighted to receive any feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love to hear feedback, and any other questions that you guys have, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, everyone. This is Katie with the library, and this was a great, great presentation. Just really good tips on walking through how to write by Lisa, practical publishing tips by Chris. Really appreciated that kind of down to earth on the researcher level conversation. And Kathryn, again, touching on open science, open access, all the different ways that Wiley and AGU are trying to make that happen in a very difficult and complex situation. And then again, touching on the DE-I&A aspect, which is very, very important to NOAA. So I want to thank you all again for coming and presenting to us today.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks all.